Welcome to our in-depth exploration of American tariff policies, a journey that spans more than a century and touches on some of the most consequential moments in U.S. economic history. Today, we're going to talk about two landmark pieces of legislation, the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. While these policies were designed to protect American interests in different eras, they offer us important lessons about how tariffs can both stimulate domestic industry and create unforeseen challenges on the global stage. Let's begin our story at the end of the 19th century. In the decades following the Civil War, America was rebuilding and rapidly industrializing. Tariffs had long served two key purposes. On one hand, they provided a vital source of revenue for the federal government at a time when income taxes were non-existent or barely used. On the other hand, they helped protect young domestic industries from the overwhelming competition of established European manufacturers. This dual role of tariffs raising government funds while shielding American producers became a cornerstone of U.S. economic policy. At that time, a spirit of optimism and self-reliance pervaded the nation. Politicians and business leaders believed that protecting local industries with higher import duties would allow them to grow strong enough to eventually compete on a global stage. In this context, the McKinley Tariff Act was born. Named after Congressman William McKinley, who later became president, this law dramatically increased tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, including tinplate, wool, and steel. The average tariff rate on many products soared from roughly 38% to nearly 50%. The goal was clear: by raising the cost of foreign goods, American manufacturers would have a chance to expand, innovate, and ultimately help the nation achieve greater economic independence. This new tariff system also had important fiscal implications. With the nation still adhering to the gold standard, maintaining confidence in the federal budget and the currency was crucial. The revenue generated by these tariffs not only helped stabilize the economy but also funded key infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, which in turn spurred further industrial development. As factories ramped up production, especially in sectors like steel and textiles, the McKinley Tariff seemed to be a resounding success for industrialists and many urban workers alike. However, as we all know, every policy comes with trade-offs. The higher prices resulting from heavy tariffs meant that everyday consumer goods items like clothing, household products, and basic necessities became more expensive. This hit lower-income families and farmers particularly hard. In addition, foreign governments were not idle bystanders. European nations, whose exports were now at a disadvantage, responded with their own retaliatory tariffs on American products, notably affecting agricultural exports from the Midwest. The backlash underscored a critical point: while protecting domestic industry was essential, it also risked setting off cycles of retaliatory measures that could ultimately disrupt global trade. Let's pause for a moment to consider a modern example that echoes these historical debates. On March 3, 2025, President Trump reinstated tariffs on imports from China, Canada, and Mexico. Moreover, there are indications that in April, a broader set of tariffs may be applied, potentially extending protectionist measures to imports from countries around the world. Those in favor of these policies view them as essential for safeguarding critical domestic industries and strengthening national security, while critics argue that such tariffs function like hidden taxes, raising consumer prices and risking further retaliatory actions from trade partners. These contemporary arguments have a familiar ring to them. They are reminiscent of the heated discussions that surrounded tariff policies over a century ago. To fully appreciate why tariff policies continue to spark such intense debate, it is helpful to examine how tariffs evolved as a central feature of U.S. economic policy. In the early years of the Republic, tariffs were not only a source of government revenue, they also served as a shield for fledgling American industries. The idea was to give domestic producers the time and space needed to grow without being immediately outcompeted by more established foreign companies. With the nation transitioning from a primarily agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse, tariffs became a critical tool for encouraging the development of domestic manufacturing and technology. After the Civil War, the United States underwent a period of rapid industrial expansion. Factories sprang up across the country, taking advantage of new technologies and innovative production methods. Railroads, too, were being built at an unprecedented pace, linking remote areas to burgeoning urban centers and opening up new markets for manufactured goods. In this environment, the need for domestic markets was more pressing than ever. Tariffs ensured that American products had a fighting chance against cheaper imports, even though this meant that consumers had to pay more for many goods. Supporters of protectionist policies argued that nurturing domestic industries was essential for long-term national growth. They believed that, with the right support, American manufacturers could eventually compete on a level playing field with European companies. This sentiment was especially strong in industrial regions, where higher tariffs were seen as a means to create jobs and stimulate local economies. On the flip side, agricultural areas and regions dependent on international trade were less enthusiastic. Farmers, who relied on exporting their goods, found themselves caught in a bind when retaliatory tariffs from Europe reduced the demand for American produce. The resulting tension between industrial and agricultural interests set the stage for many of the debates that would shape U.S. tariff policy for generations. Now, let's delve deeper into the McKinley Tariff Act itself. Enacted in 1890, the act was a bold move to raise tariffs on a select group of imports deemed crucial for the nation's industrial progress. Rather than imposing a flat rate on all imported goods, the legislation was designed with a strategic focus. Key industries such as tin plate production, wool processing, and steel manufacturing received significant protection. The rationale was straightforward: if these vital sectors could be nurtured in a controlled manner, they would eventually become strong enough to stand on their own in the face of international competition. The fiscal benefits of the McKinley Tariff were equally important. Under the gold standard, maintaining public confidence in the nation's financial systems was essential. The tariffs provided a stable and predictable revenue stream that helped finance government projects ranging from transportation infrastructure to public buildings. This revenue was particularly significant in an era when the federal government had limited options for raising funds, as income taxes were either non-existent or in their infancy. The immediate result was a notable surge in industrial production. Factories modernized their equipment, increased their workforce, and, in many cases, embarked on bold expansion plans. In sectors like steel and textiles, the protective barrier created by the tariffs allowed companies to grow rapidly and invest in innovation. Despite these successes, the McKinley Tariff was not without its downsides. The higher cost of imported goods meant that everyday products became more expensive, placing a heavier burden on consumers, particularly those in lower-income brackets. For farmers, the situation was even more complicated. When European nations retaliated with their own tariffs, especially targeting agricultural exports, the American rural economy suffered. Farmers who had hoped to benefit from a more robust domestic market suddenly found themselves facing diminished opportunities abroad. These conflicting outcomes underscored the complexity of tariff policy. While it could stimulate industrial growth and provide much-needed government revenue, it also risked creating economic imbalances that reverberated through various sectors of society. Historical anecdotes from this period offer vivid insights into the real-world impact of the McKinley Tariff. For instance, tin plate manufacturers previously struggling to compete with cheaper British imports found new opportunities under the protective umbrella of the tariff. As these companies grew, they were able to secure lucrative government contracts and invest in cutting-edge technology. In many municipalities, the increased government revenue from tariffs funded public works projects, such as the construction of bridges and public buildings, which further boosted local economies. Yet, these positive developments coexisted with growing discontent among farmers and consumers, who faced rising prices and reduced access to foreign markets. This divergence in experiences highlights the inherent tension in tariff policy. The same measure that can drive industrial progress may also create hardship in other sectors of the economy. As we move forward in time, the focus of American tariff policy shifts dramatically with the onset of the Great Depression. By the late 1920s, the United States was grappling with unprecedented economic challenges. Unemployment was soaring, deflation was rampant, and the financial markets were in turmoil. In this desperate context, many policymakers believed that a radical protectionist approach might offer a quick fix to the nation's woes. This belief set the stage for the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Sponsored by Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was introduced as a response to the dire economic conditions following the stock market crash of 1929. The idea behind the legislation was to protect American jobs and industries by making imported goods so expensive that consumers would be compelled to buy domestic products. Proponents argued that this strategy would help stabilize the economy by reducing competition from abroad and keeping money circulating within American borders. However, the scale and timing of the Smoot-Hawley tariff proved to be its undoing. Unlike the more targeted approach of the McKinley Tariff, Smoot-Hawley cast an extremely wide net. More than 20,000 imported goods were affected by the law, and tariff rates on many products were raised to an average of 53%. While the intention was to protect American agriculture and manufacturing, the consequences were severe and far-reaching. Almost immediately after its enactment in June 1930, other countries began to respond. Major trading partners such as Canada, France, Germany, and over 25 other nations imposed their own tariffs on American products in retaliation. This wave of protectionism led to a dramatic collapse in global trade. Between 1929 and 1933, U.S. imports fell by about 66%, while exports suffered a similarly steep decline. The interconnected nature of global commerce meant that as foreign countries restricted their imports from the United States, American manufacturers found it increasingly difficult to sell their goods overseas. Factories that once thrived on exports were forced to scale back production, resulting in massive layoffs and a further reduction in consumer spending. For American consumers, the impact was immediate and painful. At a time when wages were falling and unemployment was rising, the higher cost of imported goods added an extra layer of financial strain. The protective measures intended to safeguard domestic industries instead created a vicious cycle as global trade contracted. Industries suffered, leading to further job losses and decreased purchasing power. This, in turn, deepened the economic depression, making recovery even more elusive. Politically, the fallout from the Smoot-Hawley tariff was equally significant. The law, which had been championed by members of the Republican Party, became a major point of contention during the 1932 elections. Voters, disillusioned by the worsening economic conditions, placed much of the blame on the administration responsible for enacting such a sweeping protectionist measure. Both Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley lost their re-election bids, and the political landscape shifted dramatically with Franklin D. Roosevelt's ascent to power. The ensuing New Deal reforms, which emphasized government intervention and a more cooperative approach to international trade, marked a clear departure from the hardline policies of the previous era. The lessons of Smoot-Hawley were not lost on policymakers. In the years following the Great Depression, there was a growing recognition that extreme protectionism could have disastrous consequences. This realization spurred the development of new approaches to trade policy. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, for example, empowered the executive branch to negotiate tariff reductions with other countries. Over time, the United States emerged as a leading advocate for lower trade barriers and played a key role in establishing international institutions such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade GATT, and later the World Trade Organization WTO. These shifts in policy were driven by the hard-won lessons of the past unilateral. High tariffs might offer short-term relief for some sectors, but they could also trigger a chain reaction of retaliatory measures that would ultimately harm the global economy. Comparing the McKinley Tariff Act and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act reveals both similarities and stark differences. Both pieces of legislation were designed with the aim of protecting American industries, yet they were implemented in very different economic and political contexts. The McKinley Tariff, passed during a period of industrial expansion, was relatively selective in its application. It targeted specific sectors like tinplate, wool, and steel that were viewed as the foundation of a strong national economy. Although it led to higher prices for consumers and some retaliatory measures from Europe, the overall economic environment was more resilient, and the positive impacts on industrial growth and government revenue were significant. In contrast, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was introduced at a time when the global economy was already in freefall. With its broad and sweeping measures affecting thousands of imported goods, the law not only failed to protect American jobs and industries, but also contributed to a catastrophic decline in international trade. The retaliatory tariffs imposed by trading partners exacerbated the economic downturn, leading to widespread unemployment and social distress. This comparison underscores an essential truth about tariff policy: the timing, scope, and context in which such measures are implemented can dramatically alter their outcomes. Fast forward to more recent times, and we see echoes of these historical debates in modern policy decisions. For example, the tariff measures reinstated by President Trump in March 2025 have sparked a fresh round of discussions about the role of protectionism in a globalized economy. Supporters of these tariffs argue that they are necessary to safeguard national security and protect critical domestic industries, especially in strategic areas like technology and defense-related manufacturing. They contend that, in an era marked by intense international competition, such measures are essential for ensuring that America remains economically robust and secure. On the other side of the debate, critics warn that these new tariffs function much like a hidden tax. They argue that by increasing the cost of imported goods, the tariffs ultimately raise prices for consumers, reduce export opportunities for American businesses, and risk provoking retaliatory actions from other countries. This could lead to a situation very similar to the one witnessed in the aftermath of Smoot-Hawley, where escalating trade barriers led to a severe contraction in global commerce. The parallels between past and present serve as a reminder that, while the economic landscape may have changed dramatically over the last century, the fundamental challenges and trade-offs associated with tariff policy remain remarkably consistent. As policymakers and economists debate the merits of contemporary tariffs, many emphasize that any such measures must be both temporary and carefully targeted. The idea is that tariffs, if used judiciously, can provide a short-term boost to specific industries while buying time for domestic producers to become more competitive. However, if tariffs remain in place for too long or are applied too broadly, they risk creating long-term inefficiencies and sparking retaliatory measures that could damage the broader economy. This balanced approach, where protective measures are paired with clear benchmarks for their removal, aims to capture the benefits of protectionism without suffering the pitfalls that history has so clearly demonstrated. One of the key takeaways from our exploration of the McKinley and Smoot-Hawley tariffs is the importance of context. During the post-Civil War era, when America was rapidly industrializing, the McKinley Tariff played a crucial role in nurturing emerging industries and generating vital government revenue. In contrast, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was enacted at a time when the global economy was already teetering on the edge of collapse, and its sweeping measures only accelerated the downward spiral. This contrast illustrates that the effectiveness of tariff policy is not determined solely by the measures themselves, but also by the economic, political, and global environment in which they are applied. Modern policymakers are well aware of these historical lessons. In today's interconnected world, where supply chains span continents and international trade is more critical than ever, there is a growing consensus that unilateral, high tariffs can have unintended and far-reaching consequences. Many experts advocate for a more nuanced strategy, one that emphasizes multilateral engagement and coordinated efforts through international organizations like the WTO. By working together with other nations, governments can address issues such as unfair trade practices without triggering the kind of tit-for-tat retaliatory cycles that marred the Smoot-Hawley era. Another important lesson from our historical journey is the need to carefully weigh the impact of tariffs on different segments of the economy. While tariffs can provide crucial support for certain domestic industries, they can also lead to higher prices for consumers and reduced market opportunities for exporters. For example, during the McKinley era, industrial regions benefited from job creation and increased investment, even as agricultural communities struggled with reduced export markets and higher consumer costs. In modern times, Similar tensions exist between urban industrial centers and rural areas that depend on international trade. Policymakers must navigate these conflicting interests with a clear-eyed understanding of both the short-term benefits and the long-term risks associated with protectionist measures. As we reflect on the American experience with tariffs, from the optimism of the post-Civil War industrial expansion, through the hard lessons of the Great Depression, to the contemporary debates over modern trade policy, it becomes evident that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, successful tariff policy requires a careful balancing act. Protective measures must be applied with precision, ensuring that they support domestic industries without triggering adverse consequences for consumers, international partners, or the overall economy. In many ways, the debate over tariffs mirrors a broader tension in American policy between the desire for economic self-sufficiency and the benefits of global cooperation. The McKinley Tariff and Smoot Hawley Tariff each represent different responses to that tension, one offering targeted support during a period of growth, and the other a cautionary example of how broad, uncalibrated protectionism can spiral out of control. Today's discussions about tariffs, such as those surrounding the 2025 measures, show that this debate is far from settled. With global supply chains more complex than ever and international markets deeply intertwined, the stakes are higher, and the consequences of missteps can be even more severe. Ultimately, the story of American tariff policy is a story about adaptation and learning. Each era presents its own set of challenges, and the policy responses must evolve accordingly. The historical experiences of the McKinley and Smoot-Hawley tariffs remind us that while tariffs can offer a temporary shield for domestic industries, they also have the potential to disrupt broader economic stability if applied too broadly or maintained for too long. In today's dynamic economic landscape, where rapid technological changes and global interdependence define the marketplace, policymakers must draw on these lessons to craft strategies that are both effective and sustainable. Looking forward, many experts advocate for a measured, flexible approach to tariffs, one that is revisited regularly in light of changing economic conditions. They suggest that tariffs should be seen as temporary tools, deployed only when necessary, and always with a clear plan for their eventual rollback. By setting explicit benchmarks for when protective measures should be phased out, governments can avoid the trap of long-term protectionism that undermines innovation and competitiveness. This approach, coupled with ongoing multilateral dialogue, can help ensure that trade policies are responsive to both domestic needs and the realities of a global economy. As we conclude our exploration, it's clear that the legacy of the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 continues to inform debates about trade policy today. These historical examples illustrate that while tariffs can serve as powerful tools for economic development and national security, they also come with significant risks. The key to successful policy lies in understanding the specific circumstances of each era, carefully calibrating the measures to address immediate needs without compromising long-term stability, and remaining open to international cooperation. It becomes evident that the challenges and trade-offs inherent in such measures are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Whether the focus is on protecting burgeoning industries in the post-Civil War era, managing the severe economic crisis of the Great Depression, or addressing the modern realities of a globalized economy in 2025, the core issues remain strikingly similar. Every generation must weigh the benefits of safeguarding domestic interests against the risks of isolation and international retaliation, a delicate balancing act that continues to shape the nation's economic future. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel.